The morning Jedediah Stone found a woman half frozen in the briars at the bottom of a mountain ravine. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. He only knew two things. Her heart was still beating, and the cold wasn't going to wait. So he stripped the coat off his own back, bound her broken ankle with pine splints and canvas, and carried her down from the rocks on a horse that didn't like the dark. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the man who had thrown her off that mountain ridge was the same man holding the mortgage note on everything Jed had built with 30 years of blood and silence. And somewhere in the old Henderson mine, 4 miles past the timberline, a man named Gideon Rowan was chained to a beam in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to ride through a blizzard and blow a padlock off with a Winchester. Stay with me. Because this story starts with a frozen woman in a ravine and ends with something that took 5 years of guilt and one schoolteacher's pen to build.
The wind came off the peaks like a drawn razor. It was October in the Rockies, the kind of morning where the air tasted like iron and the frost bit straight through a pair of heavy leather boots. Jedediah Stone didn't mind the cold. The cold kept a man sharp. It reminded him that he was still breathing, even if he didn't have much else to say to the world. He had been up since 4. A man with 300 head of cattle on a high-altitude ranch didn't have the luxury of waiting on the sun. He had checked the south pens, drank 2 cups of black coffee that tasted like charcoal, and saddled Ranger before the sky even turned gray. Now, he was up on the northern trail, right where the granite cliffs dropped off into the timberline. The wind howled through the lodgepole pines, a long, low moan that sounded too much like a dying man. Ranger stopped. The big gelding pinned his ears back, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the mountain air. He didn't budge. He just planted his hooves and let out a low, nervous huff. "Steady, boy," Jed murmured, his voice thick and rusty from hours of silence. Jed reached down, his gloved hand resting instinctively on the cold steel of the Winchester rifle scabbard at his thigh. "Out here, you didn't look for trouble, but you didn't let it catch. You napping, either." He scanned the ridge, nothing but gray rock and shifting shadows. Then he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound. A small, ragged gasp, right from the edge of the shallow ravine, where the trail narrowed down to a sheep's path. Jed dismounted, keeping the reins loose in his left hand. He walked to the edge and looked down into the briars. His breath caught in his throat. A girl. Or a woman, it was hard to tell, with her face half buried in the dirt and the mountain dust. She was crumpled up in a nest of jagged granite and wild rose thorns. Her blue wool dress was torn to ribbons, soaked through with frozen mud. Her left boot was gone, and her bare ankle was twisted sideways, swollen and purple against the white frost. She wasn't moving. Jed dropped the reins, scrambling down the steep bank. His boots dislodged a shower of gravel, but he didn't care about the noise now. He knelt in the dirt beside her, his large, calloused hands hovering for a split second. A frontier marshal learned never to touch a body until he knew if it was a trap. A rancher learned to check for a pulse first. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. Cold, so cold her skin felt like stone. But beneath his fingertips, there it was. Thump, thump, a slow, stubborn rhythm. "Hey," Jed said, his voice dropping an octave. He gently turned her face toward the light. A deep, ugly gash ran across her left temple. The blood dried into a dark crust. Her lips were blue. She was slipping away, right there in the dirt, her body shutting down from the frost. Jed didn't waste time asking questions the mountain couldn't answer. He didn't search her pockets. He didn't look for a purse or a name tag to see if she was a lady of quality or a drifter. A human soul was freezing to death on his mountain. That was the only math that mattered. He unbuttoned his heavy shearling coat, the only truly warm thing he owned, and stripped it off his shoulders. The wind hit his flannel shirt like a pack of wolves, but he ignored it. He wrapped the heavy coat around her small frame, tucking the wool lining close under her chin. Next came the leg. He needed to bind it, or the ride down would tear the joint apart. Jed drew his hunting knife, sliced a straight, thick branch from a nearby pine, and cut it into 2 flat splints. He tore a strip of canvas from his saddle pack, wrapping her broken ankle tight and straight, his movements efficient, practiced, and surprisingly gentle for a man with hands like iron skillet weights. He lifted her. She didn't weigh much more than a sack of flour, but she groaned, a tiny, pitiful sound of pure agony that cut right through his chest. "Hold on," he muttered, hoisting her up against his chest and scrambling back up the loose dirt of the ravine. He swung her up into the saddle, mounting right behind her to hold her steady against the wind. He turned Ranger toward the valley and dug his spurs in. The hooves of the big gelding thundered into the yard of the Stone Ridge Ranch 40 minutes later. The kitchen door flew open before the dust could even settle. Abigail Stone stood on the porch, her apron flapping in the wind, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, sensible bun. She didn't scream. She didn't ask foolish questions. She took one look at the shearling coat, wrapped around the woman in Jed's arms, and turned back toward the house. "Luke!" Abigail shouted into the yard. "Get the kettle on. Boil the willow bark." Luke, the young ranch hand, came running out of the barn, his eyes wide as saucers, as Jed slid off the horse, carrying the unconscious woman up the wooden steps. "Mr. Stone," Luke stammered, pulling the door wide. "Who is she? What happened up there? Is she a legal problem? We don't know who she belongs to. What if she's trouble?" Jed carried her straight into the small bedroom off the kitchen, laying her down on the clean, white sheets of the spare cot. He turned to Luke, his face grim, the frost still clinging to his beard. "When a human soul is dying on my land, Luke, the only law that matters is the Almighty's," Jed said, his voice ringing flat and hard against the wooden walls. "The mountain can afford to be indifferent to death. It's just rock and ice. But men cannot afford to be unfeeling. If we lose our mercy, we lose everything that separates us from the beasts." Luke blinked, swallowed hard, and nodded. "Yes, sir. Now get Dr. Pratt," Jed ordered. "Ride, Ranger. Don't spare the whip." The boy vanished. Abigail was already at the bedside, her kitchen knife out, carefully cutting away the muddy, ruined blue sleeve of the woman's dress to check for more injuries. Jed stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, his shirt still damp from the snow. His own body was shivering now, but he didn't feel the cold. He looked at the girl on the bed. Her eyelids fluttered. It was just a second, a tiny fraction of time. Her chest heaved, a sharp, ragged breath catching in her throat as the warmth of the room began to fight the ice in her veins. She turned her head, her dark eyes opening just wide enough to catch the silhouette of Jed standing in the doorway. Her hand reached out of the heavy shearling coat, her fingers trembling, grasping at the empty air. "Please?" she whispered, her voice nothing more than a dry rasp against the quiet of the room. "Please, don't leave me out there." Jed didn't move. He didn't take her hand, but he didn't look away either. "You're not out there anymore," he said softly. She closed her eyes, the tension leaving her shoulders as she drifted back into the dark, but the words stayed behind, hanging heavily in the warm air of the cabin. Jedediah Stone stood there in the silence, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, knowing his quiet life on the mountain had just come to an end. The scent of boiled willow bark and warm pine resin always lingered in a room, after Dr. Elias Pratt left it. It was a clean smell, but sharp. It carried the weight of bad news or long recoveries, and Jedediah Stone knew it well. Jed stood out in the narrow hallway. His shoulder leaned hard against the rough-sawn cedar wall. He had his hands shoved deep into his denim pockets. He didn't move. He didn't look up when the bedroom door finally clicked open, and the old doctor stepped out, pulling a white wool blanket over his shoulder like a shawl against the draft. Dr. Pratt was 68 years old. His knuckles were swollen with the winter rheumatics, and his hair was the color of a salt flat, but his eyes were still as sharp as two brand-new tacks. He closed the door behind him with a slow, deliberate care that made no sound at all. "She's a tough one, Jed," Pratt said, his voice a low rumble like wagon wheels over gravel. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small tin of peppermint salve, and began rubbing it into his stiff fingers. Most women from the East would have given up the ghost before you ever reached the Northern Trail. Her lungs are clear. The fever didn't take hold. "And the leg?" Jed asked. He kept his voice down. "The ankle is broken clean through the medial malleolus. The lower bone," Pratt clarified, nodding toward the floor to point out the spot on his own boot. "I set it straight, used your pine splints, and wrapped it tight with clean linen. But she ain't walking on it, Jed. Not next week, not the week after. If she puts her weight on that foot before 6 weeks are out, she'll lame herself for the rest of her days." Jed chewed on the inside of his cheek. 6 weeks. That meant November. That meant the high bogs would be frozen solid, and the mountain passes would be choked with 6 feet of white powder before she could even step off the porch. Pratt paused, his thumb stopping on his knuckle. He looked up, his old eyes narrowing under his bushy brows. "There's something else, Jed. Something I didn't say in front of your mother." Jed straightened up off the wall. "What's that?" "The bruises on her left arm. The ones near the shoulder," Pratt said, his voice dropping even lower. "They aren't from the stones in that ravine. They're dark, shaped like 4 fingers and a thumb. Someone took a hold of her, Jed. They took a hold of her hard. And it happened a day or two before she ever went over that cliff." Jed didn't say anything. He just nodded once. The frontier had a way of leaving marks on people, but some marks were made by nature, and some were made by men who thought they owned the world. He knew the difference. "I'll be back on Friday," Pratt said, clapping Jed on the shoulder with a heavy, stiff hand. "Keep her warm, keep her fed, and keep your eyes open." Inside the small bedroom, the heat from the kitchen stove had finally driven out the mountain chill. Cassidy May Rowan opened her eyes to the sound of a cedar knot popping in the iron hearth. The ceiling above her was made of thick log rafters, peeled clean and dark with age. It wasn't the plaster and wallpaper of St. Louis. It was raw wood. It smelled of tree sap and old grease. Her ankle didn't just hurt. It throbbed with a steady, blinding heat that felt like someone had poured molten lead into her boot. Every time her heart beat, the fire in her leg flared up behind her eyes. "Don't try to move, child," a soft voice said from the shadows near the corner. Cassidy turned her head slowly, her neck stiff as a pine board. An old woman sat there in a low rocking chair. She had a bowl of cornmeal mush in her lap and a wooden spoon in her hand. Her face was lined with the deep tracks of the sun, but her blue eyes were steady and kind. "Where am I?" Cassidy asked. Her throat felt like she had been swallowing sand. "Stone Ridge Ranch," Abigail Stone said, rising from her chair, with a grace that defied her gray hair. She walked over to the bed, setting the bowl down on a small washstand, and lifted a tin cup of cold water to Cassidy's lips. My boy Jedediah found you up on the northern trail. You were nearly frozen to the rock. Cassidy drank. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it cleared the cobwebs from her head. The memory of the fall came rushing back in a dark wave, the screech of the carriage wood, the hard hand on her shoulder, the long, terrifying drop into the gray dark. She reached out instinctively, her fingers tightening on the rough wool blanket. "My bag," Cassidy whispered, her eyes wide as she looked around the unfamiliar room. "My reticule." The leather case. Did he find it? "We found nothing but you, child," Abigail said softly, sitting on the edge of the mattress. She placed a cool, damp cloth across Cassidy's forehead. "The mountain took the rest. You came here with the clothes on your back and the mud in your hair." New panic flared in Cassidy's chest. Everything was gone. Her teacher S certificate, her savings from 3 years of classroom work in Missouri, the letters from her brother Gideon. All of it was down in that dark gulch or scattered across the high rocks. She was 1,000 miles from home, unable to stand, and completely penniless. She tried to push herself up on her elbows, her face pale, her lips trembling. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice rising. "I have no money to pay you for the room. I have nothing to give the doctor. A woman without means out here, she doesn't have a place. I won't be a charity case. I can't be." The heavy oak door creaked open. Jedediah Stone stepped into the room. He had to duck his head to clear the low lintel. He had changed into a dry flannel shirt, but he still looked like he belonged to the landscape, outside big, unyielding, and thinned down by hard work. He stood at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes taking in the pale, trembling woman who was trying so hard to hide her terror behind a wall of stiff pride. "Out here in the West, Mrs. Rowan, a person's worth isn't measured by the coin in their purse," Jed said. His voice was flat, rhythmic, and perfectly calm. It filled the small room like a heavy blanket. "And women are not a debt to be calculated on a ledger sheet. You are hurt, and the right to safety belongs to everyone under this roof. It's a human right, not a business trade." Cassidy looked up at him, her fingers still knotted in the wool sheets. Her late husband, Arthur, had spent 5 years telling her exactly what she cost him: 3 meals a day, 2 dresses a year, and the price of the coal to keep the parlor warm. He had made her feel like a negative number in a merchant S-book. Hearing this rough, bearded stranger speak of her life as something that had an inherent right to safety, it felt like a shift in the earth beneath her. "I have a brother," Cassidy said, her voice dropping as she tried to regain her composure. "Gideon Rowan. He's a miner in Millhaven. If you can get word to him, he will pay for my keep. He will make it right." Jed exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with his mother. He leaned his large hands on the wooden footboard of the bed. "Millhaven is 12 miles down the valley," Jed said. "The road is clear enough for now. I'll ride in tomorrow and look for him at the assay office and the boarding houses. If he's there, I'll bring him back." "Thank you," Cassidy said. She let her head sink back onto the feather pillow. The pain in her ankle was returning now, a dull, heavy roar that made her eyes heavy. "His name is Gideon. He's all the family I have left." "Rest now," Abigail murmured, pulling the blanket up to Cassidy's chin. "The world will still be here when you wake up." Jed turned and walked out of the room, his boots making the floorboards groan. He went back to the kitchen, took his old leather ledger book off the shelf, and sat down at the heavy pine table. He didn't open it. He just sat there in the fading evening light, staring at the blank cover, thinking about the 4 finger marks on a woman's arm and the long, cold winter that was coming down from the peaks. By the third day, the sun came out over the high valley, turning the white frost on the pine needles into a million tiny, blinding mirrors. Cassidy sat in a high-backed wooden chair near the kitchen window. Jed had spent the previous afternoon in the tool shed using an old oak barrel and a pair of discarded wagon spokes to build a crude, rolling seat for her. It wasn't elegant. The wheels squeaked with every turn. And the seat was hard, but it gave her back her feet. It allowed her to move from the bedroom to the hearth without asking for a hand to hold. Abigail Stone was at the long pine table, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she worked a wooden paddle through a large ceramic bowl of yellow cream. The rhythmic thump slosh of the butter churning was the only sound in the kitchen. "The wind is turning from the southwest today," Abigail said, nodding toward the window without stopping her arm. "That means the weather will hold for another 48 hours. Out here, Cassidy, you learn to read the sky like a book. If you don't pay attention to the clouds, the mountain will catch you with your woodpile empty." "It's different from St. Louis," Cassidy said, her fingers tracing the smooth grain of the oak armrest. "In the city, the weather is just an inconvenience. You buy an umbrella or you stay inside the storefront. Here, it feels like the land is the one making the rules." "It is," Abigail smiled, a soft, wrinkled creasing of her eyes. "And the first rule is that everybody works, even an old woman with bad knees and a girl with a broken leg." She pushed a small wooden tray of dried pumpkin strips toward Cassidy. "Here, take the kitchen knife and slice these into small squares for the winter stew. A woman's hands don't need feet to be useful." Cassidy took the knife. The cold steel felt good in her hand. It was simple work, repetitive and grounded, and for the first time in 3 days, the constant, low-grade humming of her nerves began to settle. She sliced the orange rind, the sweet, earthy smell of the dried squash rising up to meet her. But as the kitchen grew quiet, the silence brought the memories back. She closed her eyes, and suddenly, she wasn't in the warm kitchen anymore. She was back in the belly of the leather-sprung stagecoach, 24 hours out of Denver. She remembered the dust. It had been everywhere, settling in the pleats of her traveling dress and clogging her throat. She remembered the driver, a man named Dobb with a broken nose and eyes that never looked straight at anyone. He had been nervous when she boarded. He kept checking the heavy brass watch in his waistcoat pocket. There had been one other passenger, a man in a fine black wool suit and a gray Stetson hat. He had introduced himself as an investor from Boston, but his hands weren't the hands of a clerk. They were wide, hard, and he wore a heavy gold signet ring on his right middle finger, a ring carved with the shape of an eagle holding a snake in its talons. He had been polite at first. He had offered her a peppermint drop. Then he had looked at the leather luggage tag on her trunk. She had written herself, "Cassidy Rowan, care of Gideon Rowan, Millhaven, Colorado." The man's eyes had gone cold. Not angry, just empty, like a frozen pond. "You read Gideon Rowan, sister?" he had asked. His voice had been very soft, very low against the rattle of the coach wheels. When Cassidy had nodded, the man had reached across the narrow space between the seats. He didn't hesitate. He took her by the left arm, his forefingers and thumb digging into her flesh until she cried out from the pressure. "Your brother found something he shouldn't have found, Mrs. Rowan," the man had said, his face inches from hers, "and he ran before he could sign the papers. You're going to help us find him, or you're going to pay his debt." Then the coach had jerked violently. Dobb had shouted from the box above. The door had swung open, the mountain air rushing in. And the last thing Cassidy remembered was the hard, flat palm of the man's hand hitting her chest, pushing her out into the empty gray air as the carriage rounded the high, unprotected curve of the northern trail. The knife slipped. Cassidy gasped, dropping the blade onto the pine table. It clattered against the ceramic bowl. She was trembling all over, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts, her left arm throbbing where the old bruises were still hidden beneath her sleeve. "Cassidy?" Abigail asked, stopping her churn paddle. "What is it, child? Did you cut yourself?" "It wasn't an accident," Cassidy whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at the pumpkin tray. "The fall. The carriage. He pushed me." The front door opened with a sudden sharp crack. Jedediah Stone walked in, his spurs jingling against the threshold. He carried a heavy sack of grain on his shoulder. His dark with the mountain dust. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen, his sharp eyes instantly fixing on Cassidy's pale face and her trembling hands. He set the grain sack down on the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't ask her if she was hysterical. He didn't tell her she was imagining things. He walked straight over to the window, pulled up a three-legged stool, and sat down right in front of her rolling chair, his face level with hers. "Tell me," Jed said. One word. Rhythmic and steady as an anvil. Cassidy took a deep breath, forcing the air into her lungs until her chest ached. She looked into Jed's dark, unblinking eyes and told him everything. She told him about the dust, about Dobb the driver, about the man in the black suit, and about the gold ring with the eagle and the snake. She told him about the grip on her arm and the hard push that had sent her into the ravine. Jed listened. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't interrupt her once, just sat there with his large, scarred hands resting on his knees, absorbing her words like dry earth, absorbing the rain. When she finished, the kitchen was completely silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Jed stood up slowly. He walked over to the water bucket, took the tin dipper, and drank before turning back to face her. "The man with the gold ring," Jed said, his voice dropping into that low Marshall's register that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "That's Silas Vance. He owns the Millhaven Mining Company and 3/4 of the town property. He is the biggest man in the county, and he doesn't like people who don't sign his papers." "My brother," Cassidy said, her voice rising with fear. "Did you find him in town? Is he safe?" Jed looked down at his boots, then back up at her. He didn't believe in softening a blow when the truth was what a person needed to survive. "I found out where he was, Cassidy," Jed said, using her Christian name for the very first time. "He isn't at the boarding houses, and he didn't leave the territory. A week before you arrived, Vance S. Foreman put out a report saying Gideon Rowan was killed in a cave-in at the lower copper shaft. They closed the tunnel and buried the entrance." Cassidy felt the room tilt. The orange pumpkin pieces on the table blurred into a single muddy smear. "Killed?" she whispered. "No, no, he can't be." Jed stepped closer, his big frame blocking out the light from the window, grounding her back to the room. "Listen to me, Cassidy," Jed said, his voice hard as iron. "A cave-in means bodies. In this territory, the law says every dead miner has to be brought up for a proper burial and recorded at the county seat. That's a matter of basic human dignity. Vance didn't bring anybody up. He just put timber over the hole and walked away. That means one of two things. Either your brother is still down there, or he never was." Cassidy looked up at him, her tears finally spilling over her cheeks, but her jaw set into a firm, hard line that matched his own. "He's alive," she said. "He has to be. Then we'll find him." Jed said, turning toward the door to grab his gun belt off the wooden peg. But we play this quiet. Vance thinks you're dead at the bottom of that mountain. We let him keep thinking it until we know exactly what your brother found under that rock. The ledger book lay open on the pine table. The ink was old, fading from black to a dull, rusty gray. Jedediah Stone sat with his chin in his hand, a stub of lead pencil held between his thick fingers. He wasn't a clerk. He didn't like numbers, and he didn't like the way they always seemed to tell a man how much he had lost instead of how much he had left. He was staring at his own handwriting from 3 winters back. He had spelled barbed wire with 2 BS in the middle. It looked wrong. It looked clumsy. A small, pale hand reached into the lamplight. Cassidy May Rowan didn't say a word. She just took the pencil from his fingers, turned it over, and used the soft rubber edge to wipe the extra letter away. Then, with 3 quick, elegant strokes, she wrote it out clean, B-A-R-B-E-D. Jed looked at the page, then up at her face. Her hair was pulled back with a scrap of blue ribbon, and her skin had a bit of color back in it from the kitchen heat. "You've got a schoolteacher's eye," Jed said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "My father always said a man with a bad hand at the pen is a man who didn't spend enough time listening to the chalkboard." "It isn't about the chalkboard, Mr. Stone," Cassidy said. She leaned against the table. Her weight shifted back onto her good right leg. "It's about clarity. Out here, if a man signs a bill of sale with an error in the description, the law doesn't care about his intentions. The law only looks at what is written on the parchment," Jed grunted. He closed the book with a soft puff of dust. "The law out here usually looks at who has the biggest Winchester, Mrs. Rowan, but I take your point." The door to the back porch creaked open. Miguel came in, his canvas coat, smelling of wet horsehair and cold mud. Behind him came his 2 boys, Leo and Mateo. They were 9 and 11, with dark, solemn eyes and boots that were 3 sizes too big, stuffed with dry slough grass to keep the frost out. They stood by the door, holding their felt hats against their stomachs, looking at the floorboards. "The horses are fed, Senor Jed," Miguel said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "The north ditch is clear of ice for now." Cassidy looked at the 2 boys. She saw the way they watched the ledger book on the table, not with curiosity, but with a strange, heavy distance. It was the look of a person standing outside a window in the rain, watching a fire they weren't allowed to sit by. "Leo," Cassidy said softly, her voice carrying that gentle, rhythmic lilt she used when she wanted a frightened child to stand still. "Come here a moment." The boy looked at his father. Miguel gave a short, tight nod. Leo stepped toward the table, his oversized boots clacking against the pine. Cassidy pushed the open ledger toward him. She pointed to a line of text. "Can you tell me what that word says, Leo?" The boy stared at the ink. He bit his lower lip until it turned white. He didn't speak. He didn't even try to shape his mouth around the letters. He just shook his head, a deep, burning red creeping up his neck from beneath his frayed collar. "He don't read, Senora," Miguel said from the door. There wasn't anger in his voice, just a flat, tired acceptance. "The town school in Millhaven. The trustee, Mr. Vance, he says. The desks are for the taxpayers' children. He says the children of the ranch hands don't need the alphabet to dig a ditch or brand a calf." The kitchen went dead, silent. The only sound was the iron grate on the stove expanding against the heat. Cassidy didn't yell. She didn't stomp her foot. But Jed saw the way her fingers tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles and turned the color of lard. She looked up at Jed, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, sharp fire he hadn't seen in her before. "Is that the way of it out here, Mr. Stone?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "A child is denied his mind because of his father's wages." Jed stood up. He walked over to the wood box, picked up a split piece of cedar, and tossed it into the stove. He took his time about it, letting the latch click shut before he answered. "Vance owns the schoolhouse building, Cassidy," Jed said. He used her name deliberately, flat and plain. He built it with his own timber, and he pays the Master S salary out of the Mine S company store. He likes his workers dependent. A man who can't read a contract is a man who can't see how the store charges him double for his flour. Cassidy turned back to Leo. She didn't look at Jed again. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small, leather-bound primer, the one thing she had kept in her pocket when she fell from the carriage. She laid it flat on the pine. "Tomorrow morning," Miguel said it, looking the father straight in the eye, "you bring Leo and Mateo to this kitchen 2 hours before the noon meal. I will teach them." Miguel hesitated, his eyes shifting to Jed. "Senor Jed, the ranch work." "The work will be here, Miguel," Jed said. He stepped up beside Cassidy, his big frame blocking out the draft from the doorway. "Bring him in. A boy who can't read his own name is a boy who can't ever leave this valley. And I don't intend for any man on my land to be a slave to Silas Vance's ledger." The next morning, the kitchen became a battlefield of iron and ink. Jed didn't go out to the range immediately. He stayed in the tool shed behind the cabin, the sharp rasp of his hand plane, throwing up long, curling ribbons of sweet-smelling pine. He took 3 old fence pickets, planed them down until they were smooth as silk, and cut them into flat, square rectangles about the size of a dinner plate. He didn't use nails. He used wooden pegs, joining the pieces until he had 2 small, sturdy hand slates for the boys. He walked into the kitchen and dropped them on the table, without a word. Cassidy looked up from her rolling chair. She was showing Mateo how to hold a piece of charcoal against the wood. She looked at the slates, then up at Jed. She didn't say thank you, but her head tilted just a fraction of an inch, an acknowledgement between 2 people who knew that a tool was only as good as the hand that held it. Jed sat down on the bench by the water bucket, pulling his boot grease tin from his pocket. He began rubbing the lard into the seams of his leather boots, his movements slow and rhythmic, keeping time with the scratch of the charcoal on the pine slates. "ABC, Cassidy chanted softly, her voice steady as a clock. "Every letter is a brick, Leo. You put them together, and you build a wall that no man can climb over to steal what belongs to you." "A," Leo whispered, his charcoal shaking against the board. "B. Good," Cassidy said. "Now look at the word land. Land. In the state of Colorado, a man can claim 80 acres under the Homestead Act if he files the parchment with his own name. If he can't write his name, he has to use an X. Do you know what an X means to a land speculator, Mateo?" The older boy shook his head. "It means the man is blind," Cassidy said, her voice dropping into a hard, rhythmic cadence that sounded like law. "It means he cannot read the boundary lines on the map. It means the speculator can shift the fence 10 yards to the east, and the man who signed with an X will never know he has been robbed until his well goes dry. Trituk homfila su sasi kakona. Nalaquin koban de bauve singmang, but tutzal kuchingming." Knowledge is not a luxury, children. It is the basic right required to protect your own life and freedom. Jed stopped his hand on his boot. He looked at the boys, their heads bowed over the wooden slates, their fingers black with carbon. He thought about his own father, who had marched him into a sod schoolhouse in Kansas 30 years ago with an empty stomach and a slate that was cracked down the middle. A man who can't defend his own mind is a man who's already beaten, his father used to say. Listen to the lady boys, Jed said from the corner. He didn't look up from his boot grease. She's giving you the only weapon in this territory that don't need gunpowder to kill a lie. By noon, the boys were gone back to the cattle pens, their slates tucked under their greasy coats like gold bullion. Cassidy sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap. The kitchen was quiet again, the blue wood smoke drifting toward the rafters. Jed stood by the stove, pouring the remainder of the black coffee into 2 tin cups. He brought one over and set it on the sill beside her. "You're a good teacher, Cassidy," he said. "They want to learn, Jedediah," she said, using his full name, her eyes looking out over the brown grass of the valley toward the dark line of the mountains. That's the tragedy of it. The world tells them they are stupid until they believe it. My husband, Arthur, he spent 5 years telling me that a woman's mind was like a small garden, only good for flowers and berries, but not strong enough for the timber of real thought. Jed took a sip of his coffee, burned his throat, but he liked the heat. He leaned his hip against the window frame, his large shoulder casting a long shadow across the room. "Your husband was a fool," Jed said simply. "Out here, a garden don't survive without timber to fence it in. A woman who can't think is a woman who dies before the first blizzard is out." "He wanted me small," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper. "He wanted me where he could count me, like his cattle." Jed looked at her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her small fingers were gripped tight around the tin cup. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder for a second, before he let it drop back to his side. He wasn't a man for touching, but the silence between them didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like the weight of a stone foundation, waiting for the house to be built on top of it. "Silas Vance thinks the same way," Jed said, his voice hardening as he looked toward the road that led to Millhaven. "He thinks the people in this valley are just coal for his engines. But coal can catch fire if you leave it in the dark too long." The carriage arrived on Thursday, just as the sun was dipping behind the western peaks, turning the snowfields into a violent, blood-red sheet of light. It wasn't a common frontier buckboard. It was a black painted brougham with yellow wheel spokes and silver lamps on the box. The twin horses were matched bays, high-stepping and glossy, their breath coming in twin plumes of white steam as the driver brought them to a hard stop in the middle of the Stone Ridge yard. Jed was on the porch before the horses had even stopped shaking their heads. He had his gun belt on, the heavy Colt riding low and familiar against his thigh. He didn't take his hands out of his pockets. The carriage door opened. Silas Vance stepped out onto the frozen mud. He wore a long coat of black broadcloth with a collar of gray beaver fur. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his gray Stetson was pinned with a small silver band. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off the train from Boston, except for his eyes. His eyes were small, pale, and completely still, like the eyes of a hawk watching a sage hen from the top of a telegraph pole. On his right hand, the gold signet, Ring the Eagle, holding the snake, gleamed in the dying red light. "Jedediah," Vance said. His voice was smooth, melodic, and perfectly pitched, the voice of a man who spent his days speaking to judges and territorial governors. He climbed the porch steps with a slow, measured stride, his hand extended. "It's been a long time since I smelled the cedar smoke up here on the ridge." Jed didn't take his hand. He just stood there, his back straight as a fence post, blocking the door to the cabin. "Vance," Jed said, "the cattle are all branded. The taxes paid. I don't recall inviting the mining company to my yard." Vance smiled, his lips pulling back over clean white teeth. He didn't look offended. He dropped his hand back into his fur-lined pocket and turned to look out over the valley, his eyes taking in the 300 head of Stone Ridge cattle grazing on the lower meadow. "A beautiful spread, Jed," Vance murmured. "Your father took this land when the Utes were still hunting the creek beds. A lot of sweat in this dirt. A lot of blood, too, if I remember the Indian raids of '64. "My father died with his boots on, Vance," Jed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, dangerous cadence. "And he left the land clear." "Clear?" Vance turned back, his smile disappearing like grease on a hot skillet. He reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out a folded square of blue parchment, tied with a legal red ribbon. He held it up between two fingers. "Not quite, Jed. The Denver Bank held a note on your winter feed loan from 2 years back. $3,200. You missed the October interest payment by 4 days." Jed's jaw tightened until the bone clicked. The beef market was late this year. The buyers in Cheyenne didn't settle the accounts until Tuesday. The bank gave me 30 days grace. "The bank did?" Vance whispered, leaning in close until Jed could smell the clove pomade in his hair. "But I bought the note from the bank on Monday morning, Jed, as a favor to an old neighbor. I own your mortgage now. Every post, every wire, and every head of beef from here to the timberline belongs to the Millhaven Mining Company if I choose to file the foreclosure papers tomorrow morning." The wind howled through the porch railings, a cold, dry whistle that made the yellow wheels of the carriage groan. Jed didn't move. He didn't look at the paper. His hand stayed loose near his holster. "You didn't ride 12 miles up a mountain trail to talk about beef loans, Silas," Jed said. "What do you want?" Vance tapped the blue paper against his open palm. "A girl came through Denver last week, a school teacher from Missouri. She was looking for a man named Gideon Rowan. Dobb tells me his carriage had an accident near the high rocks on Monday morning. He says the girl went over the edge." "The mountain don't forgive mistakes, Vance," Jed said, his face as blank as a stone wall. "No, it doesn't," Vance agreed, his pale eyes shifting past Jed's shoulder toward the small curtained window of the kitchen. "But Dobb went back down the gulch with a lantern on Tuesday night. He found some broken pine branches and some horse tracks leading south toward your trail. He didn't find a body." Vance took a step closer, his fur coat brushing against Jed's flannel shirt. He lowered his voice until it was almost lost in the wind. "Gideon Rowan found something in the lower shaft that didn't belong to him, Jed," Vance said. "He has some ideas about geology that don't align with the mining company's interests. His sister has his letters. I want those letters, Jed, and I want the girl. You give her to Dobb when he comes up with the buckboard tomorrow, and this blue paper goes into the kitchen stove. You keep your ranch. You keep your cattle. Your mother keeps her house for the winter." Jed looked at the gold ring on Vance's hand, the snake twisting in the eagle's claws. He thought about Cassidy May Rowan, sitting in her wooden wheelchair inside the kitchen, her small fingers black with charcoal as she showed a poor boy how to write the word land. He thought about the 4 finger marks on her arm. He took his hands out of his pockets. He didn't pull his gun, but he stepped down 1 step, his large body completely filling the doorway, his eyes burning into the mining baron's face. "My father told me there are things a man can sell. Vance, Jed said, his voice carrying a flat, absolute finality that echoed off the cabin logs. He can sell his beef, he can sell his horse, and he can sell the timber from his woods. But the honor and the life of a guest who has trusted your home can never be bartered away. He leaned down until his face was inches from Vance S. If I keep this land by selling out an injured woman, then this ranch is nothing but a graveyard for morals. Take your note and get out of my yard before I forget I ever wore the badge of the law. Vance's face went white. The skin around his mouth twitched, his pale eyes hardening into two cold beads of flint. He folded the blue parchment back into his pocket with a slow, jerky motion. "You're a fool, Jedediah Stone," Vance said, his voice shaking with a quiet, venomous rage. "You're choosing a stranger over your own mother's roof. By Monday morning, the sheriff will be up here with a dispossess warrant. I'll turn your cattle into the high snow, and I'll burn this cabin to the ground." "You can try," Jed said. Vance turned on his heel, his heavy broadcloth coat swirling around his boots as he stormed back to the carriage. He slammed the door behind him, and the driver dug his whip into the matched bays, the yellow wheels spinning into the dark as the carriage vanished down the mountain trail. Jed stood on the porch until the sound of the wheels was completely gone, swallowed by the roar of the pines. The cold was setting in now, deep and bitter, but his blood felt hot in his veins. He turned the iron latch and walked back into the kitchen. Cassidy was sitting by the hearth. She had heard every word through the thin logs of the window. She looked up at him, her face pale in the firelight, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, something that looked like reverence. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your ranch, your mother's home, you've lost everything because of me." Jed walked over to the corner, picked up his Winchester rifle from the gun rack, and began running an oily cloth down the blue steel barrel. He didn't look up, but his movements were steady, rhythmic, and perfectly calm. "I haven't lost a thing yet, Cassidy," Jed said, the grease smelling sharp and clean in the warm room. "A house is just logs and mud. But a man's soul? Once you let a man like Silas Vance put a price tag on that, you don't ever get it back." The crutches were crude, but they worked. Jed had spent the dawn hours hacking down 2 straight limbs of mountain ash. He peeled the bark back until the pale, damp wood beneath was smooth to the touch. He patted an underarm rests with scraps of old horse blanket and bound them tight with strips of oiled latigo leather. Cassidy May Rowan stood in the center of the kitchen, her weight balanced between the 2 ash poles. Her left foot hung an inch above the floorboards, wrapped tight in Dr. Prass' clean linen bandages. She took a step. The wood groaned, the leather bindings creaked, but she stayed upright. "They re heavy," Cassidy said, her breath catching slightly as she shifted her hips. "But they have a true balance." Jed stood by the dry sink, buckling his canvas ammunition belt. He didn't look up, but his thumb traced the brass rims of the 44 cartridges lined up in the loops. "Ashwood don't snap when you put your weight on it, Cassidy," Jed said. His voice was flat, keeping time with the click of his belt buckle. "Pine has knots, willow bends, but ash remembers where it grew. It holds its line." He threw a dark wool shawl over her shoulders. It was an old piece that belonged to his mother, smelling faintly of lavender and lye soap. He reached down and picked up a pair of heavy leather riding gloves, dropping them into her lap as she sat back down in the rolling chair. "We re-going into Millhaven?" Jed said. "Miguel has the spring wagon hitched. We leave through the timber trail, not the main road." If Vance has eyes on the ridge, he'll be looking for a man on a horse, not a load of firewood. The town of Millhaven sat in the belly of the gulch like an old boot dropped in the mud. It wasn't a town built for living. It was a town built for taking. The main street was nothing but a wide ditch of frozen black mire, flanked on both sides by false-fronted frame buildings that looked like they might tip over if the wind blew hard enough from the north. There were 4 saloons, 2 assay offices, a livery stable that smelled of rotten hay, and the great timber gallows of the Millhaven Mining Company rising up on the hill behind it, all like a giant wooden hand. The air smelled of sulfur and wet slag. It was a thick, greasy smoke that settled on a man's tongue and stayed there. Miguel stopped the wagon behind the blacksmith-esque shop, right where the old charcoal bins broke the force of the wind. Jed climbed down first, his boots sinking 3 inches into the frozen muck. He didn't offer to carry Cassidy. He knew her pride by now. Instead, he reached into the wagon bed and handed her the ash crutches, standing close enough to catch her if the wood slipped on the ice. She swung herself down. Her jaw was so tight the muscle in her cheek looked like a cord of rope. She didn't complain about the smell, and she didn't complain about the cold that bit through her wool stockings. "Where is the booty at the post office?" Cassidy asked, her voice steady against the rattle of the blacksmith's hammer nearby. "Down past the stable," Jed said, pointing with his chin. "Next to the land commissioner's office. But we don't go there together. A Goa Fu Gie Chun, a crippled widow, and an ex-marshal walking the street together is a show this town don't need to see." He led her toward the side door of the general store, where the roof overhang kept the boardwalk clear of snow. "You sit on the dry goods bench inside," Jed told her, his hand resting on the wooden door frame. "Look at the flannel. Look at the thread. I am going to find Frank Salter at the sheriff's office. If he is still the man I knew 5 years ago, he'll tell me how many men Vance has on the payroll this week." "And if he isn't?" Cassidy asked. Jed looked down the street toward the silver lamps of the Golden Eagle saloon. "Then I'll know that, too." The general store was dark, smelling of smoked bacon, vinegar barrels, and unwashed wool. Cassidy sat on a low bench near the back, her ash crutches leaning against her knee. Her ankle was throbbing again, a dull, heavy ache brought on by the jolt of the spring wagon over the frozen ruts. She held a bolt of gray calico in her lap, her fingers moving over the rough cotton cloth to keep from checking the door every time the latch clicked. A woman walked out from behind the curtain of the back storeroom. She wasn't old, but she had the kind of hardness around her eyes that only comes from spending too many nights under the glare of kerosene lamps. Her hair was a bright, artificial red, piled high on her head with bone pins, and her dress was made of green silk that had seen better days. The hem was stained with beer and trail mud. She carried a small tin box under her arm. She stopped short when she saw Cassidy. Her eyes dropped to the ash crutches, then to the pale line of Cassidy's jaw. "You re the Rowan girl," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low, raspy. She had spent too much time shouting over the noise of a piano. Cassidy didn't move. She kept her hands flat on the gray calico. "My name is Cassidy Rowan. Do I know you?" "No," the woman said, stepping closer until Cassidy could smell the peppermint drops and cheap rose water on her skin. "I knew your brother, Gideon. My name is Maeve Larkin. I work the tables." At the Golden Eagle, Cassidy felt her heart give a hard, painful leap against her ribs. She let the bolt of cloth slide off her lap. "Gideon. Is he? Do you know where he is?" Maeve looked toward the front windows, where the town street was visible through the dirty glass. She sat down on the other end of the bench, her green silk dress rustling loudly against the wood. She set the tin box between them. "He ain't dead, Cassidy," Maeve whispered, her voice dropping into a tight, urgent hiss. Vance's men put out that story about the cave-in because they needed to clear the boarding houses out. They didn't want anyone asking why the lower shaft was locked with 3 iron padlocks. "Where is he?" "They got him up at the old Henderson mine," Maeve said, her fingers tracing the rusty latch of the tin box. "It's 4 miles out, past the timber line. Vance has 3 guards up there with repeating rifles. They re-keeping him in the old pump house until he signs the deed over to the company." She pushed the tin box into Cassidy's lap. "Gideon gave me this 2 nights before they took him," Maeve said. "He told me if anything happened to him, there'd be a girl coming from St. Louis with his letters. He told me to give it to nobody but you." Cassidy lifted the lid. Inside was a rolled piece of heavy geological linen and 3 small chunks of rock. The stones weren't the red, green-veined copper ore she had seen in the store windows. They were dark, almost black, with a heavy, dull, metallic luster that looked like old lead. "Look at the weight of it, Cassidy," Maeve said, her hand reaching into the box to lift one of the stones. Cassidy took the rock from her. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, nearly twice the weight of a common piece of ironstone. She rubbed her thumb over a fresh scratch on the side of the mineral. Beneath the black tarnish, a bright, brilliant silver streak gleamed in the dim lamplight. "That ain't copper," Maeve said, her eyes fixed on the silver streak. "That's argentite, high-grade silver ore. Gideon found it running 3 feet wide right through the middle of Vance's copper claim. Under the territorial mining laws of 1872, if a miner discovers a new mineral vein on an existing claim, he has the right to file an independent discovery patch if he registers it with the Federal Land Office before the claim holder finds out." Maeve leaned closer, her hard face softening for just a fraction of a second. "Gideon didn't want to steal it, Cassidy," Maeve said. "He wanted to file it legal so he could build a school for the miners' kids and pay the men a living wage. He told me the law was supposed to protect the man who does the digging, not just the man who owns the shovel." Cassidy held the silver rock against her palm, her fingers closing tight around its sharp edges. She thought about her late husband, Arthur, who had used his knowledge of the law to squeeze every tenant farmer on his land until they had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. He had told her that the law was a whip made for the backs of the poor. But looking at this rock, hearing Maeve speak of her brother Estream, she saw something else. She saw that the law could be a shield if a person had the courage to hold it straight. "In this territory, Maeve," Cassidy said, her voice dropping into that hard, rhythmic teacher's cadence. "According to Section 2320 of the revised statutes, a discovery claim is valid the moment the mineral vein is exposed to the light. It does not require Silas Vance's permission. It requires the truth. The law of this country, at least on paper, states that every citizen has the right to own the fruits of their own labor. Anyone who uses chains to steal that right is a thief, no matter how expensive his suit is." "Vance don't care about the statutes, Cassidy," Maeve said grimly. "He has the sheriff in his pocket, and the territorial judge is his first cousin. He makes his own law out here." "Then we'll have to bring a bigger law," Cassidy said. The side door opened, and Jedediah Stone walked back into the shop. His coat was covered in a fine layer of gray sulfur dust, and his face looked like it had been carved out of the mountain granite. He didn't look at Maeve. He didn't look at the tin box. He walked straight to Cassidy and stood over her chair. "Frank Salter is gone," Jed said. "Vance sent him down to Denver with a load of bullion guards. The man sitting behind the sheriff's desk now is a deputy named Dobb." Cassidy looked up, her fingers tightening around the silver oar. "The carriage driver?" "The same," Jed said. "He wearing the tin star now. That means Vance owns the county court until the circuit judge comes through next spring." "We don't have time to wait on the law, Cassidy." Cassidy reached into the tin box and pulled out the rolled piece of geological linen. She unrolled it flat on the calico bolt, showing him the hand-drawn lines her brother had made, the timber coordinates, the watermarks, and the small red cross labeled Henderson Shaft 400-foot level. "Gideon is alive, Jedediah," she said, her voice cutting through the dark store like a sharp knife. "He's at the old Henderson mine. Silas Vance is holding him in the pump house until he signs this silver claim over to the company. Maeve just gave me the map." Jed leaned down, his eyes scanning the ink lines on the linen. His large thumb came down on the red cross. He didn't ask if Maeve was lying. He didn't ask if it was a trap. He just looked at the silver rock still clutched in Cassidy's left hand, his face perfectly still. "The Henderson mine is old workings," Jed said, his voice dropping into that low, rhythmic marshal's rumble. "The timbers have been rotting since the silver panic of '73. It's bad air down there. Cassidy, a man don't survive a month in those wet shafts." "Then we go tonight," Cassidy said. She gripped her ash crutches, her face pale, but her eyes burning with that cold, steady fire. "He's my brother, Jed. I won't leave him to rot in the dark, because Silas Vance owns the sheriff's badge." Jed looked at her for a long time. The general store grew quiet, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer fading into the evening air. He reached down, took the silver rock from her hand, and dropped it back into the tin box, closing the lid with a sharp, decisive click. "Miguel," Jed called out toward the back door. "Get the horses out of the wagon. Tell Luke to saddle Ranger and the mule. We going up to the timber line before the moon hits the ridge." He turned back to Cassidy, his hand resting on the handle of his Colt. "You stay with my mother at the ranch, Cassidy," Jed said. "This ain't work for a woman with a broken bone." "I can ride, Jedediah," she said, her jaw setting into that immovable Rowan line. "And I can hold a slate or a gun, whichever one the situation requires. If you think I'm going to sit by the hearth and pray while my brother is chained to a mine beam, you don't know the stock I came from." Jed didn't argue. He knew his post couldn't be argued with once it was sunk 3 feet into the dirt. He just nodded once, his boots making the floorboards groan as he turned toward the door. "Can you shoot straight?" he asked over his shoulder. "Teach me," she said. 3:00 in the morning is not morning at all. It is just the deepest part of the dark, right before the cold decides to settle into a man's bones for good. Jedediah Stone stood in the shadow of the livery shed, tightening the cinch on Ranger S. saddle. The big gelding didn't like the hour. He kept tossing his head, his bit clicking against his teeth like a handful of loose pebbles. Jed worked by touch. Out here, a lantern was nothing but a target for a man with a long-range rifle, so you learn to let your fingers do the seeing. He felt the leather latigo. He found the third hole, pulled it tight, and tucked the strap away clean. A shadow moved near the kitchen steps. It was small. It moved with a slow, rhythmic thump creak that Jed had grown used to over the last week. Cassidy May Rowan came down the wooden ramp Jed had built over the stairs. She didn't have her rolling chair now. She had the two ash crutches tucked under her arms, her long wool skirt pinned up on the left side to keep it clear of her white bandages. Behind her came Abigail, carrying a small canvas sack filled with salt pork, hardtack, and a tin of sulfur salve. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't cry. She just reached up and tucked a small silver medallion, the one that had belonged to Jed S. father, into the pocket of Jed S. leather vest. "The mountain is quiet tonight, Jedediah," Abigail said. Her voice was low, barely louder than the wind in the pine tops. "That means the sound will travel. An iron shoe on granite can be heard 2 miles off if the air stays dry. Taking the old deer path through the draw," Jed said, checking the chamber of his Winchester by the grease light from the kitchen window. "The pine needles are thick down there. It'll dull the noise." He turned to Cassidy. She was standing by the gray pack mule, her face pale beneath her wide-brimmed felt hat. "You sure about this?" Jed asked. "Once we cross the creek, there ain't no turning back because your ankle feels hot. You fall off that mule in the dark, and I'm going to leave you where you drop." Cassidy didn't flinch. She swung her right crutch forward, balanced her weight, and looked him straight in the eyes. "I didn't travel halfway across this continent to sit by a kitchen stove while my brother is buried alive, Mr. Stone," she said. Her voice was thin from the cold, but it didn't shake. "You lift me up onto that pack saddle, and I'll stay there until the work is done." Jed didn't say another word. He stepped in close, grabbed her by the waist with his large, calloused hands, and hoisted her up onto the wide back of the mule. She gasped once when her left leg brushed against the stirrup leather, but she didn't scream. She caught the reins in her gloved hands and sat straight, strapped her ash crutches flat against the mule-less pack frame, mounted Ranger, and pointed his horse toward the dark line of the timber. The trail to the old Henderson mine wasn't a road. It was just a scar in the earth made 30 years ago by the Ute Indians and widened by the timber cutters who had stripped the slopes to build the first sluice boxes in the gulch. The higher they went, the thinner the air got. It tasted like cold tin. Every time Ranger took a breath, his ribs expanded against Jed S. boots like an accordion. Cassidy rode behind him, her mule following Ranger S. tail with a slow, stubborn patience. The path narrowed down to a shelf of loose shale. To the left, the mountain went straight up into the black sky. To the right, it dropped 500 feet into a canyon filled with jagged pine tops. The mule stumbled. A shower of loose gravel went over the edge, the small stones clicking against the rock face as they fell into the dark. Cassidy lost her balance, her body tilting toward the canyon. She didn't scream. She threw her weight toward the high wall, her fingers locking into the mule's coarse mane. Jed was off horse before the stones stopped falling. He caught the mule's BS bit with his left hand and reached up with his right, his large palm coming down hard on Cassidy S.'s shoulder, pressing her back into the center of the saddle. He stayed there for a long second, his breathing heavy in the quiet air, his face inches from hers. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin, the sharp, terrified thumping of her heart beneath her wool shawl. "You okay?" he muttered. "Yes," she whispered. Her fingers were shaking against the mule's neck, but she didn't let go of the leather. The stirrup slipped on the shale. Jed reached down, adjusted the leather strap, and checked the girth. Then he looked up at her, his eyes dark under the brim of his hat. "Out here, Cassidy," Jed said, his voice slow and rhythmic, keeping time with the wind in the rocks. A man don't look at the sky when his horse is on a ledge. He looks at the 4 inches of dirt right in front of his animal S hooves. You let your mind wander to what S at the bottom of the hill, and that S exactly where you end up. Notcher has no pity, Miss Rowan. It only tests whether your step is steady or not. My husband always told me that accidents were a sign of a weak character, Cassidy said, her voice dropping into that bitter, distant tone she used when she spoke of St. Louis. He said if a person was smart enough, they'd never find themselves in the mud. Jed grunted. He stepped back to Ranger S' side and swung back up into the saddle. Your husband was a city man, Jed said over his shoulder. In the city, you got pavements to hide your mistakes. Out here, the earth don't hide nothing. A good man can break his leg in a gopher hole on a sunny Tuesday. It ain't about being perfect. It's about what you do after you find yourself in the dirt. They rode on into the timber, the trees closing in around them like the walls of a great, dark church. The Henderson mine looked like a ghost that had forgotten to die. It sat in a high, rocky basin just below the snow line. There was an old wooden headframe, 40 feet high, its timbers gray and cracked like old bones. Below it were 3 shacks made of unpeeled logs, their roofs sagging under the weight of old pine needles. A single yellow light leaked out from the window of the largest cabin, the old pump house. Jed stopped Ranger behind a thick clump of mountain mahogany. He dismounted, pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, and crouched down in the low brush. Cassidy watched him from the mule, her hands tight on the pommel. There's 3 horses in the corral, Jed whispered, pointing with the barrel of his rifle. One, S, a buckskin that belongs to Vance S. Foreman. The other 2 are common livery stock. That means 3 men inside or close by. Where would they keep Gideon? Cassidy asked. The pump house has a deep cellar, Jed said. It's cess where they used to keep the steam valves from freezing in the winter. It's cess 4 feet of solid stone underground. Only one way in and one way out. He turned back to her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, short-barreled Remington Derringer, a double-barrel pocket pistol that had belonged to his father. He slid it into her gloved hand. If things go sideways, Luke is going to create a diversion down by the old sluice boxes with a couple of dry sticks and some black powder, Jed said. When you hear the noise, you stay on this mule. You hold this iron in your lap. If anyone comes through these bushes wearing a black coat and a gold ring, you don't talk to him. You pull the trigger until the clicking starts. Cassidy looked down at the small gun. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of whale oil. She took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the checkered walnut grip. In Missouri, Jedediah, she said, looking at him through the dark, they taught us that the law was the only thing that separated men from wolves. They said, taking a life without a judge. S warrant was the greatest sin a Christian could commit. Jed looked out at the yellow window of the pump house. He could see the shadow of a man passing across the glass, a long, thin shadow carrying a whiskey bottle. The law is a fine thing when the judge is honest, and the jury don't work for the mining company, Cassidy, Jed said. His voice was flat, rhythmic, and perfectly calm. But when the law is bought to chain an honest man in a dark cellar, that kind of law is no longer justice. It is only the tool of a tyrant. Your brother's right to defend himself and his right to be free, those are laws given by God. Before men ever learned to write words on paper, he stood up, his tall frame disappearing into the mahogany bushes without another sound. The waiting was the hardest part. Cassidy sat on the mule, her left ankle throbbing in time with the wind. The silence of the mountain basin was so thick, she could hear the mule's teeth grinding against the leather bit. She held the small Remington pistol inside her shawl, her thumb resting on the cold, cross-hatched hammer. Boom! A sudden, flat roar shook the basin from the south side of the ridge. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the heavy, thudding crunch of black powder exploding inside an empty timber box. A long plume of gray smoke rose up into the pine trees, and a shower of sparks lit up the dark meadow. Inside the pump house, the door flew open. Two men ran out onto the gravel, shouting at each other as they hauled their rifles out of the doorway. They didn't look toward the mahogany bushes. They ran straight toward the smoke, their heavy boots clattering against the frozen rocks. A third man stayed in the doorway. He was shorter, wider, with a dirty canvas coat and a red handkerchief tied around his neck. He held a lantern in his left hand and a short shotgun in his right. He looked around the dark yard, his eyes suspicious, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the wind. He took 3 steps toward the corral. A shadow rose out of the dirt behind him. Jedediah Stone moved like a mountain cat, silent, heavy, and perfectly sure of his ground. He didn't use his rifle. He caught the guard by the throat from behind, his large left arm cutting off the man's wind before he could even let out a gasp. The lantern dropped into the mud, the glass cracking with a soft pfft as the flame died. The guard thrashed, his heavy boots kicking up a cloud of gravel, his shotgun discharging into the dirt. But Jed held on. His shoulder was jammed hard into the man's spine, his grip tightening until the guard's knees went soft and his rifle slipped from his fingers. Jed lowered him to the ground, took a length of hemp rope from his belt, and bound the man's hands and feet with 3 quick professional knots. Jed turned toward the bushes and waved his hat once. Cassidy didn't wait. She dug her right heel into the mule's flank, guiding the animal out into the open yard. By the time she reached the porch of the pump house, Jed had already kicked the wooden door off its latch. The inside of the cabin was filthy. It smelled of rancid bacon, sour whiskey, and the heavy, damp stench of underground water. In the center of the room, a square trapdoor was set into the floorboards, held open by a wooden prop. Jed was already down the ladder. Cassidy scrambled off the mule, her ash crutches hitting the floor with 2 sharp cracks as she swung herself into the doorway. She leaned over the edge of the dark opening, her heart in her throat. Down in the stone pit, 50 feet below the surface, a single tallow candle was burning on an empty powder keg. A man sat against the stone wall. His clothes were torn to rags. His beard was long, matted with gray mud, and his face was so thin the cheekbones looked like they might cut through the skin. A heavy iron chain was looped around his waist, fastened to a thick cedar timber with a massive blacksmith-esque padlock. "Gideon?" Cassidy called out. Her voice broke on the name, echoing hollowly against the wet stone. The man in the cellar lifted his head slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, blinking against the faint light from above, but when he saw the silhouette of the woman with the ash crutches, a sudden wild light flared in his face. "Cassidy," he gasped, his voice a dry, rattling whisper. "What? What are you doing out here?" "I told Maeve to tell you to stay in Denver." Jed was already at the chain. He didn't waste time on greetings. He placed the cold barrel of his Winchester right against the hinge of the iron padlock, turned his face away, and pulled the trigger. The report inside the stone room was deafening, a sharp, blinding flash of white light that threw a cloud of iron splinters into the air. The lock shattered into 3 pieces. Jed hauled the heavy chain off Gideon's waist, caught the thin man under the arms, and hoisted him toward the wooden ladder. "Move," Jed said. Vance men are going to be back from that ridge in 3 minutes, and I don't intend to be here to pass the time of day with them. They scrambled up into the kitchen light. Cassidy dropped her right crutch, reaching out with her free hand to grab her brother arm. Gideon looked like a ghost, his hands shaking as he touched her face to make sure she was real. "You're alive," he whispered. "They told me you went over the cliff." "I'm alive, Gideon," she said, her tears finally running down through the dust on her cheeks. "But we have to ride." Now, Jed was already at the door, his Winchester held ready as he scanned the dark timberline. The wind was rising again, carrying the smell of fresh snow from the peaks. "Luke," Jed shouted into the dark, "bring the horses up, running out of night." The kitchen was quiet when the dawn came up. It wasn't the bright, hard red of the autumn sun anymore. It was gray. It was thick with the heavy, white mist that comes down off the peaks, right before the clouds drop their first true load of winter snow. The cedar fire in the iron hearth didn't roar. It just hissed, a steady, rhythmic crackle that kept the cold back from the frost-lined window panes. Gideon Rowan sat on the low bench by the woodbox. His hands were tucked between his knees to stop the shaking. He had eaten 3 bowls of Abigail cornmeal mush, his spoon scraping against the ceramic until the glaze was clean. He looked smaller now that the mine mud was washed off his face, his skin the gray, translucent color of a potato, kept too long in a dark cellar. Dr. Pratt stood over him, his old fingers pressed hard against the ribs on Gideon's left side. "Too cracked," Pratt said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the warm room. He didn't use his stethoscope. He didn't need to. He knew the sound of broken bone under flesh the way a blacksmith knows a flawed shoe. Vance's foreman had a heavy boot. "Gideon, you lucky the bone didn't pierce the lung wall." "I've had worse from a cave-in, Doctor," Gideon whispered. His voice was flat, dried out by the damp air of the pump-house cellar. "A cave-in is the mountain's doing," Pratt said, pulling a long strip of clean, unbleached muslin from his black leather bag. He began winding it tight around Gideon's chest, his movements stiff but perfectly certain. "A boot is a man's choice. There's a difference in the accounting." Jedediah Stone stood by the dry sink, his thumb running over the smooth ash wood of Cassidy's extra crutch. He hadn't taken his boots off since they crossed the creek at 4 in the morning. His flannel shirt was damp from the valley mist, smelling of pine smoke and wet horsehair. He watched his mother. Abigail Stone wasn't looking at the doctor. She wasn't looking at Gideon. She was standing by the long pine table, her old hands trembling slightly as she held the small tin box Maeve Larkin had smuggled out of the Golden Eagle saloon. The geological maps were unrolled flat on the wood, held down at the corners by a salt cellar and a heavy iron satiron. Beside the paper lay the small silver crucifix necklace that Cassidy had taken from her throat to keep it from rattling against her crutches during the ride. Abigail lifted the silver chain. She held the small cross up into the gray light of the window, her eyes fixed on a tiny hand-stamped mark. On the back of the metal bar, 3 small dots arranged in the shape of a clover leaf. "Jedediah," Abigail said. Her voice didn't rise, but it had a strange, tight ring to it that made the room go completely still. "Where did you say the girl got this piece?" Jed shifted his weight off the dry sink. "It was her mother, Ma. Clara Rowan. She brought it out from St. Louis before the no-none, the Debts, took the house." Abigail turned around slowly. Her blue eyes were wide, wet at the corners, but her mouth was set into a firm, straight line that looked exactly like the granite cliffs on the northern trail. She walked over to the bench where Gideon sat, her old wool skirt rustling loudly against the woodbox. "Your mother wasn't a Rowan by birth, Gideon," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. Gideon looked up, his bloodshot eyes blinking against the lamplight. "No, ma'am. Her name was Clara Davenport before she married my father in '42. She was from the hill country down near Cumberland Gap." Abigail let out a long, shuddering breath. She sat down on the very edge of the bench beside him, her hand reaching out to touch the coarse gray wool of his sleeve. Her fingers were shaking now, really shaking, the veins blue and prominent against her wrinkled skin. "She was an associate nurse," Gideon, Abigail said, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence that sounded like she was reading from an old family Bible. "During the great sickness of '51. The cholera came up the river from New Orleans on the steam packets. It took my husband's brother, and it took 40 men in our township in less than 3 weeks. Everyone ran, Gideon. The doctors packed their buggies and went into the hills. The preachers closed the church doors." She lifted the silver crucifix, letting the metal chain drape over Gideon's open palm. "Clara Davenport didn't run," Abigail said. "She stayed in the log hospital by the creek for 22 days. She boiled the well water, she washed the linens in lye, and she held my eldest girl, Sarah, in her arms until the fever broke at midnight. She didn't ask for $1, and she didn't ask for a name. She told me she did it because a human being in a fever has a right to a clean bed and a cool hand, no matter what language they speak or what church they own." Gideon looked down at the silver cross. A small, ragged smile touched the corners of his chapped lips. "That sounds like her, ma'am?" "She always said a person who walks away from a sickbed because of the fear is a person who's already dead inside." Abigail turned to look at Cassidy, who was sitting in her rolling chair by the stove, her dark eyes wide as she listened to the old woman's words. "You look like her, Cassidy," Abigail said softly, her voice carrying the heavy weight of 25 years of memory. "You have her eyes, and you have her chin. When my Jedediah brought you through that door 3 days ago, wrapped in his shearling coat, I thought the mountain had just sent me another mouth to feed. But it wasn't the mountain. It was the Lord's balance. Your mother saved my family when the world was dark, and today my boy saved you. Sometimes people think they are just moving forward, Cassidy, but life is actually a circle. What we give away in kindness from one generation, it comes back to protect our children in this generation when the storm arrives." Cassidy didn't say anything. She couldn't. She reached out her small, charcoal-stained fingers and wrapped them tight around Abigail's hand, the two women holding on to each other in the gray morning light, while the men stood by in silence. By afternoon, the gray mist had turned into a steady, drifting skiff of dry snow. Jed sat on the top rail of the corral fence, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He was watching the 300 head of Stone Ridge cattle huddled together in the lower draw, their red backs dusted with white powder. Ranger stood below him, his nose tucked into Jed's knee, his breath coming in long, rhythmic plumes of steam. The squeak of the oak wheels announced her before she reached the gate. Cassidy had rolled her chair out onto the split-log porch, her ash crutches laid across her lap. She had a thick wool blanket pinned around her waist, her face sharp and clear against the white background of the hills. She looked out at the cattle, then up at Jed. "Gideon is sleeping," she said. "The doctor gave him a draft of laudanum for the pain." Jed didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes on the white peaks. "He'll need a week of that sleep before he can hold a shovel again, Cassidy." Vance S. Cellar is a hard place to winter. He told me about the silver, Jedediah, she said, her voice steady against the whistle of the wind through the lodgepoles. He told me he found the vein running 3 feet wide through the granite. He has the coordinates written down in his pocket case. It don't matter what he found, Cassidy, Jed said. He pulled his tin of tobacco from his vest, took a pinch, and tucked it into his cheek. His movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a man who knew exactly how much wood he had left in the pile. Vance has the mortgage note on this ranch. He has the sheriff's office in his pocket. By Monday morning, he'll have a legal dispossess warrant from the county judge. He don't need your brother's signature to take this land. He just needs the winter to freeze us out. Cassidy leaned forward in her chair, her fingers locking onto the wooden armrests. Then we don't give him the winter, she said. Jed turned his head slowly, his dark eyes taking her in under the brim of his Stetson. What are you thinking, teacher? The territorial mining laws of 1872 are very clear, Jedediah, she said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic, hard classroom cadence that sounded like she was reading a statute book to a row of unruly boys. Section 2324 states that if a discovery claim is contested by a mortgage holder, the dispute cannot be settled by a county judge. It must be referred to the Federal Land Commissioner in Denver within 14 days of the initial filing. Silas Vance thinks he is the law in Millhaven because he owns the saloon and the Deputy Star. But the federal government owns the mineral rights under these mountains. Vance is a big fish in a very small pond, Mr. Stone. But Denver is the river. She reached into her shawl and pulled out the rolled geological linen, holding it up like a flag against the drifting snow. Gideon registered his initial line with the district clerk 2 weeks ago, before they locked him in the pump house, Cassidy said. The clerk didn't enter it into the big ledger, because Vance told him to forget it. But Gideon has the duplicate receipt, stamped and signed with the official seal. If we can get that receipt, and these maps to the Federal Land Commissioner in Denver before Monday morning, Vance's mortgage note won't be worth the ink it was written with. He can't foreclose on a property that is under federal mineral injunction. The law of this country is not a leather whip meant only for the poor, Jedediah. If we know how to use it, it can be an iron shield to force men like Silas Vance to play fair before the light. Jed looked at the blue paper in her hand, then down at his horse. He climbed off the fence rail, his heavy boots hitting the snow with a dull, muffled crunch. He walked over to her chair, leaning his large hands on the oak wheels so he was looking straight into her face. Denver is 80 miles through the high passes, Cassidy, Jed said. His voice was very quiet, very low. The snow is already coming down. A man on a fresh horse might make it in 2 days if the wind don't turn into a blizzard. A woman with a gay Seung Mat Ka, a broken ankle, and a miner with 2 cracked ribs wouldn't make it to the creek line. I know, she said. She didn't look down. She didn't blink against the snow that was settling on her eyelashes. That's why you're the one who has to ride, Jedediah. Jed stayed there for a long second, his breath coming in short, regular puffs between them. He looked at the sharp line of her jaw, the way her small fingers were gripped tight around the linen map. 5 years ago, when his wife, Margaret, had died in the fire down by the river, he had made a promise to himself. He had sworn he would never leave the ridge again. He had thought that if he stayed in one place, if he kept his mouth shut and his fences high, the world wouldn't be able to find him to take anything else. But looking at this woman, this stranger, who had come off his mountain with nothing but a broken leg and a tin box of rocks. He saw that his silence hadn't been a fortress at all. It had just been a hiding place. And a man who spends his whole life hiding is a man who's already given up his right to be a man. Frank Salter is down in Denver, Jed said, his voice hardening as he made his decision. He's the only man in that territory who remembers what my old marshal's badge looked like. If I can find him at the territorial office, he'll get me through the door to the commissioner. He will, Cassidy said. Jed reached out, his large, rough hand coming down over hers, covering her small fingers, and the rolled linen map together. He didn't pull away this time. He held her hand tight against the wood of the chair arm, the heat from his palm soaking through her leather glove. You stay inside with the Winchester while I am gone, Jed said. Miguel and Luke have the repeating rifles in the barn. If Dobb comes up that trail with his dispossessed papers before I get back, you don't talk to him through the window. You let the lead do the talking. I'll be ready, Jedediah, she said. He looked at her face for one more second, then turned and walked toward the stable to get his winter saddlebags. The snow was coming down faster now, big, lazy flakes that blotted out the brown grass of the draw. But for the first time in 5 long winters, Jedediah Stone didn't care about the storm. The snow didn't fall in flakes anymore. It fell in needles. It was Saturday afternoon, and the white drift had already climbed to the second rail of the horse corral. The wind was coming straight out of the northern throat of the canyon, a long, steady scream that rattled the cedar shingles on the cabin roof until the old iron nails groaned in their holes. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of tallow, coffee dregs, and wet wool. Gideon Rowan lay flat on the iron cot in the corner, his chest bound tight with Dr. Pratt's muslin bandages, his eyes staring blankly at the dark rafters above. Cassidy sat beside him in her rolling chair. She held her Father S. small Remington Derringer in her lap, her thumb tracing the cross-hatched steel of the hammer, over and over again. Thump, thump. It wasn't her crutches. It was the heavy, rhythmic beat of horse, hooves out in the frozen yard. Jedediah Stone didn't move from his spot by the window. He had been standing there for 3 hours, his Winchester rifle resting across his forearm, his eyes fixed on the white curtain of the trail. Through the swirling drift, a single rider emerged. The horse was a heavy iron gray, its chest white with frozen lather, its head hanging low against the wind. The man in the saddle wore a tan camlet coat with a brass star pinned to the lapel. It wasn't Dobb. It was Deputy Frank Salter. Jed clicked the latch on the kitchen door and stepped out onto the porch before Frank could even pull his reins. He didn't invite him inside. He just stood on the top step, his flannel shirt snapping in the gale, his rifle held loose but ready across his waist. Frank climbed down off the gray horse, his knees cracking so loud Jed could hear them over the wind. He didn't look like a lawman who had come to foreclose a ranch. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days riding through a graveyard. He walked up the steps, his gloved hands shaking, as he pulled a folded piece of white paper from his inside pocket. "Jed," Frank said. His voice was rough, choked with the gray sulfur dust of the valley. Vance filed the papers with the circuit clerk in Denver on Friday morning. He got the territorial governor's signature on a writ of assistance. Dobb is coming up the trail tomorrow morning with 6 men from the mine crew. They rebringing the torch, Jed. Vance told him if the cattle are still in the draw, they to drive 'em over the high cliffs into the bogs. Jed didn't take the paper. He didn't even look at it. Frank Jed said, his voice flat and steady as an anvil. You've known my family since the Kansas border wars. You know my father didn't build this chimney for Silas Vance to light his cigars with. Frank looked down at his boots, his face turning a deep, burning red beneath his frozen beard. He dropped his hands to his sides, the white paper fluttering in the wind before he gripped it tight again. I know, Jed, Frank whispered, but Vance has the judge in his purse. He told me if I didn't bring this warrant up today, he'd have my brother, S. Homestead, claim in the valley, canceled by Monday noon. Out here, a man either does what the money tells him to do, or he watches his family freeze in the ditch. The kitchen door creaked open behind them. Cassidy stood in the doorway, her weight balanced perfectly between her two ash crutches. Her face was pale, but her eyes were two bright, cold beads of flint. She looked at the brass star on Frank's coat, then straight into his face. Is that the lesson you're teaching the children of this territory, Deputy? Cassidy asked. Her voice carried that hard, rhythmic classroom cadence that made both men turn their heads. That the tin star on your chest is just a license to be a coward? That if a man is rich enough, the law will help him burn an old woman-s house and kill an honest man-s cattle? Frank swallowed hard, his jaw working as he looked from the woman, with the crutches back to Jed's grim face. You don't understand, lady, Frank stammered. Vance don't just take land. He takes people. 5 years ago, when Jed's wife, Margaret, went over the riverbank, everyone said it was an accident. They said. Jed left the pasture gate open, and the horse took fright at a thunderclap. Jed's hand tightened on the Winchester until the wood groaned. The air in his lungs suddenly tasted like hot iron. What are you saying, Frank? It wasn't no thunderclap, Jed, Frank said, the tears finally freezing on his cheeks as he spoke the words he had hidden for 5 long winters. Vance wanted the water rights on your lower creek. He told his foreman to fire 3 rounds from a buffalo rifle near your line fence to make your stock run. He didn't know Margaret was out there on the mare. The shots spooked her horse, Jed. It wasn't your fault. You didn't leave no gate open. Vance knew it. His foreman knew it. And they gave me $50 in gold to keep my mouth shut at the coroner's inquest. The wind seemed to drop all at once, leaving the porch in a terrible, suffocating silence. The only sound was the steady hiss-hiss of the snow against the cedar logs. Jedediah Stone didn't yell. He didn't pull his Colt, but the shadow he cast across the porch looked 10 feet tall, his large frame rigid as an iron stove. 5 years of self-blame. 5 years of sitting by a cold hearth, believing he had killed his own wife, because of a careless latch fell off his shoulders like a sack of lead stones. It didn't leave him light. It left him dangerous. He walked down the steps, took Frank by the canvas collar with his bare hand, and pulled him until their faces were inches apart. 5 years, Frank, Jed said. His voice was so low, it was almost a whisper, but it cut through the wind. Like a razor blade, I buried my girl and my woman in that dirt because I thought I was the one who failed them. I stopped looking men in the eye because of your $50 in gold. Kill me if you want to, Jed, Frank choked out, his eyes closing. I deserve it. But Vance? Vance is the who ordered the lead. Jed stayed there for a long second, his chest heaving against his flannel shirt. He looked at the brass star on Frank's coat. Then he let go of the collar, pushing the deputy back against the gray horse. He didn't pull his gun. He turned to Cassidy, who was watching him from the doorway, her dark eyes filled with a deep, silent reverence. Cassidy, Jed said, his voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic marshal's register. Get your brother's geological receipt from the tin box. Write a letter to the editor of the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. Tell him about the silver vein, tell him about the pump house cellar, and tell him about the $50 Vance paid to bury a woman's death. He turned back to Frank Salter, his face hard as the granite on the northern trail. You going to ride back to Millhaven? Frank, Jed ordered. You tell Dobb and you tell Silas Vance that Jedediah Stone is staying on the ridge. And you tell him that the next piece of lead that flies across my fence line won't be aimed at no horses. According to the law of this county, Frank, a sworn deputy, has a duty to enforce justice, not to be a servant to a mining baron's greed. Today you gave me back the truth, and that is the only thing that saved you from that ditch. Now, wear that badge properly and stand with honest men. Frank looked at the blue paper in his hand. Then he tore it into 4 pieces and let the wind carry them into the snowdrifts. He mounted the gray horse, his face straight for the first time in 5 years. I'll see you at the creek line tomorrow morning, Jed, Frank said, and I'll be bringing my own Winchester. The sun came out on Monday morning like a new copper coin. The storm had broken at midnight, leaving the high valley under 3 feet of clean, blinding white snow that made the lodgepole pines look like rows of silver candles. The road to Millhaven was a long, white ribbon, untouched by any tracks until the black-painted brougham of Silas Vance came rounding the lower curve of the creek trail. The carriage stopped 50 yards from the Stone Ridge gate. Silas Vance didn't have his mine crew with him. He didn't have the torches. Behind his carriage rode 2 men in dark blue suits from the United States Land Office in Denver, their horses sleek and fat, their saddlebags packed with official government leather cases. Beside them rode Deputy Frank Salter, his Winchester held across his saddle horn, his brass star gleaming under the winter sun. Jedediah Stone stood at the corral gate. He had his sheepskin coat on now, his hands tucked loose in his pockets, his horse ranger standing behind him, with his reins over the rail. Vance stepped out of the carriage. He didn't have a smooth Boston smile today. His black broadcloth coat was buttoned crooked, and his face was the color of old lard, his pale eyes shifting from Jed to the 2 federal officials with a frantic, desperate rhythm. On his right hand, the gold signet ring looked heavy and dull against his white skin. One of the federal men, a tall, gray-headed gentleman named Mr. Albright, stepped his horse forward. He pulled a heavy parchment document from his leather case, the grand gold seal of the United States territory of Colorado catching the morning light. Mr. Stone, Albright called out, his voice sharp and formal in the crisp air. The Federal Land Office in Denver received your courier at midnight on Saturday. We have reviewed the geological maps and the original duplicate receipt filed by Gideon Rowan for the discovery claim on the Henderson shaft. Under Section 2326 of the revised statutes, the Millhaven Mining Company's corporate charter is hereby suspended pending a federal investigation into mineral fraud and unlawful detention of a sovereign citizen. Vance took a step forward, his polished boots sinking deep into the white drift. His voice wasn't melodic anymore. It was a high, thin screech that sounded like a dry axle. "This is an outrage," Vance shouted, his hand shaking as he pointed toward the cabin. "That ranch is mine. I hold the mortgage note. The bank sold it to me legal. I have the right to foreclose on any man who don't pay his interest." Albright didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Jed. "The mortgage note is stayed by federal injunction, Mr. Vance," Albright said, his voice flat as a judge's hammer. a property containing an active, verified federal mineral discovery, cannot be seized by local civil action until the discovery rights are settled in the district court. Your claim on this valley is dead, sir, and Deputy Salter here has an arrest warrant from the territorial marshal regarding the confinement of Gideon Rowan. Frank Salter stepped his gray horse forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Let's go, Silas. The cell in Millhaven is cold, but it's dry enough for a winter stay. Vance looked around the white yard. He looked at the two federal men. He looked at Frank S. Winchester, and then his eyes traveled up to the porch of the cabin. Cassidy May Rowan stood there by the railing. She didn't have her ash crutches now. She was sitting in her wooden rolling chair, her brother Gideon standing right behind her with his hand on her shoulder. She looked down at the mining baron, who had pushed her off a mountain ridge to bury her voice. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She just sat straight, her chin held high, her dark eyes filled with the quiet, unyielding peace of a person who had fought the dark and won her place in the sun. Vance looked at her for one long second, his mouth twisting with a quiet, bitter venom. Then he turned and walked back into his carriage, his polished boots leaving two deep, messy tracks in the clean snow. The carriage turned around slowly, its yellow wheels crunching against the ice, as Frank Salter followed it down the trail toward the town. 6 months later, the green grass had come back to the high valley. The snow on the peaks had melted down into 100 tiny, rushing creeks that filled the lower meadow with the scent of wild clover and damp earth. The 300 head of Stone Ridge cattle were fat, their red coats glossy under the May sun as they grazed near the new willow fences Jed had built along the creek line. A new wooden building stood near the main corral. It wasn't large, just 30 feet square, but the logs were peeled clean, and the windows were made of real glass that caught the afternoon light like silver mirrors. Above the door, a small pine sign was carved with 2 clean words, the Rowan School. Inside, 8 children sat at the long pine tables Jed had built from the old timber cutter's logs. Leo and Mateo were in the front row, their faces clean, their fingers holding their pieces of charcoal with a steady, confident pride. They weren't looking at the floorboards anymore. They were looking at the large chalkboard at the front of the room where the alphabet was written out in a beautiful, curving hand. Cassidy stood by the desk. She didn't need the rolling chair today. She had a small leather brace around her left ankle, and she leaned slightly on a single cane made of polished ash wood, but her step was certain, her body moving with a slow, rhythmic grace that belonged to the room. LND, Leo read aloud, his voice clear and proud as he pointed to his board. Land. Good, Leo. Cassidy smiled, her hand resting on his shoulder. And what does that word mean to a free man? It means his home, Senora, the boy said, looking up at her with his dark, bright eyes. It means the place where no man can tell him to leave. That's right, Cassidy said, her voice carrying that gentle, rhythmic lilt that filled the open windows of the schoolhouse. Love and knowledge, children, are the only 2 things in this world that become richer the more you give them away. Men like Silas Vance want to keep you in the dark so they can easily chain your feet to the mines. But once you know how to read and how to think, no chain can hold you as a slave anymore. Education is the greatest equal right of humanity before the light. The door to the schoolhouse creaked open. Jedediah Stone stepped into the room. He had his hat in his hand, his hair damp from the creek water, his leather vest open over a clean flannel shirt. He stood by the back wall, his large frame silhouetted against the green meadow outside, watching her with a quiet, unblinking reverence that made her heart give a soft, familiar leap against her ribs. He waited until the children were dismissed, their boots clattering out into the sunshine like a flock of young quail. Cassidy walked over to the back bench, her ash cane clicking softly against the pine floor. She stopped right in front of him, looking up into his weathered face, her eyes taking in the small lines around his mouth that had finally learned how to smile. Jed didn't say a sweet word. He didn't reach for her hand right away. He pulled a folded piece of white parchment from his vest pocket and laid it flat on the school table between them. It was a new deed, registered at the federal office in Denver the previous Tuesday. It carried 2 names at the top, written in the official clerk's black ink. Jedediah Stone and Cassidy May Rowan, joint owners of the Stone Ridge claim. "I had the clerk write it up legal, Cassidy," Jed said. His voice was a low, rhythmic rumble that felt as solid as the log walls around them. "Out here, a man don't ask a woman to share his life unless he's ready to share his dirt. 50-50, from the fence line to the peaks. You re my partner, Cassidy, in the schoolhouse and on the range." Cassidy looked at the paper, her fingers tracing the black ink of her own name beside his. She thought about the cold October morning when she had lain at the bottom of that dark ravine, her ankle broken, her mind convinced she was nothing but a worthless debt to be cast out by the world. She looked up at the rugged rancher who had climbed down into the briars to find her. "The mountain took everything I thought I was that morning, Jedediah," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, emotional whisper. "It took my home, my savings, and my pride. But the man who lifted me onto his horse, he gave it all back to me. Not the life I had lost back east, something better. A life where I am seen, where I am respected, and where I am allowed to stand straight as your equal." Jed reached out, his large, rough hand coming down over hers, his fingers locking between hers, with a slow, powerful pressure that carried the weight of 5 winters of waiting and a lifetime of devotion. "You always stood straight, Cassidy," Jed said softly. "The mountain just brought you to the place where the rest of us could see it." He drew her close against his chest. The smell of the spring clover and the clean pine wood surrounding them like a benediction as they stood together in the doorway of their own schoolhouse, looking out over the wide, green Thung Lung, the valley that would be their home for all the years to come.
If this story moved something in you, if it made you hold your breath on that mountain ledge or feel the cold of that mine cellar, then do one small permanent thing. Press like so the next reader can find their way here. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they were never the problem, and subscribe so you never miss the next voice rising out of this valley. The peaks are wide, the school is open, and we are just getting started. There is a moment near the beginning of this story that is easy to miss because it happens quickly and without ceremony. A rancher climbs down into a ravine full of briars, finds a stranger at the edge of death, and makes a decision in about 3 seconds. He does not ask who she is. He does not check to see if she is worth saving. He takes off the only truly warm thing he owns and wraps it around her shaking shoulders. That moment, that 3-second decision made by a man who has been hiding from the world for 5 years, is the seed from which everything else in the story grows. And the lesson buried inside it is one of the most ancient truths the human race has ever discovered and then promptly forgotten every few generations. The worth of a human life does not require proof. It does not require a name, a pedigree, a coin in the purse, or a letter of introduction. It requires only that another human being is willing to look at it and say, "This matters. This person deserves to live." Jedediah Stone says it plainly to his young ranch hand when the boy starts asking nervous questions about legal problems and who the woman belongs to. When a human soul is dying on my land, the only law that matters is the Almighty's. It is a statement made by a man who has spent 5 years behind high fences, believing that silence and isolation were the same thing as safety. And yet when the test came, when the body of a stranger was in the dirt of his mountain, the fences dissolved. The real man stepped forward because some truths about who we are do not submit to the walls we build around them. The second lesson runs alongside the first and is equally important. Cassidy May Rowan arrives at Stone Ridge Ranch with nothing but a broken ankle and a desperate, bone-deep pride that has been shaped by years of being told she is a cost, a liability, a small garden that grows berries, but not timber. Her late husband Arthur counted her like livestock. He made her feel like a negative number in a merchant's book. And so when Jed tells her that her right to safety is a human right and not a business trade, that women are not a debt to be calculated on a ledger sheet, she experiences it not as a compliment, but as something closer to a revolution. Because for years the world had told her the opposite, loudly, consistently, with the full weight of social custom behind it. The injury Abigail's husband did to Cassidy is the same injury that Silas Vance did to Leo and Mateo by locking them out of the schoolhouse. It is the same injury Vance did to the miners in the valley by keeping them dependent, illiterate, and unable to read the contracts that stole their wages. It is all the same wound, delivered by the same instrument, the deliberate, calculated denial of a person's right to understand the world they live in. Because a person who cannot read the deed cannot defend the land. A woman who has been told her mind is a small garden cannot imagine standing at the head of a schoolroom. A child who has been taught that the alphabet is not for him will spend his whole life signing his name with an X. And every man who wants to shift his fence line 10 yards east will find him an easy target. This is why Cassidy's schoolhouse is not a subplot. It is the spine of the entire story. Every act of courage, the midnight ride to the Henderson mine, the geological maps carried through a blizzard, the letter to the Rocky Mountain News, all of it flows from the same source, the absolute conviction that knowledge is not a luxury. It is the basic right required to protect your own life and your own freedom. Education is the only weapon in this territory that don't need gunpowder to kill a lie. Jed says it from his corner, his eyes on his boot grease, and it is the most important sentence he speaks in the whole long winter. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.